Hello, everyone. I'm Becca, dietitian by trade, mom 24/7, wife from the start, and when there's a few extra hours in the day, you might find me hitting the trails or on horseback.
And I'm Kara, a therapist to women, a mom to a boy, an entrepreneur, mountain junkie, and a postpartum runner.
And this is Fit for a Queen, a podcast that's devoted to the female athlete wanting to balance the teeter-totter of all the things we desire out of life as women: performance, health, intellect, and taking time for self, even if we only get 1 minute out of the day.
We're so excited to be bringing you the queens in the athletic world who have done just that. Okay, ladies, take a seat at your thrones, grab your crowns, and welcome to Fit for a Queen.
Well, queens, we are so excited to have Isabel Foxen today on the show. Isabel Foxen is the creator of Stop Fighting Food, a free video training program for women who want to stop feeling crazy around food. After years of trying to overcome emotional eating, binge eating, and chronic weight cycling through traditional and alternative approaches, Isabel discovered some radical new ways to get women over their food issues once and for all, not just by shifting the mindsets of individuals, but by challenging the dominant diet culture as a whole. A fixture and thought leader in the greater body positive movement, Isabel has been, I just lost your bio, has been featured on numerous shows, including getting lots of recognition from Ricky Lake. She has wrote a free guide called How to Not Eat Cake, and it can be found on www.isabelfoxenduke, which of course we will put in our show notes. And you can watch her free series at www.stopfightingfood.com. Welcome, Isabel.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, Isabel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Let's do it.
Well, yeah. First, tell us how your journey led you to be the blogger, podcaster, and coach that you are today.
Well, so I think that I had an experience growing up that is actually most women, certainly in our culture, and increasingly more people in our culture can relate to from a very, very young age. I started dieting when I was super young. And so, from the time I was about 3 years old, that was when I was put on my first diet, which I know is insane. Literally by a pediatrician. A pediatrician put me on my first diet at 3 years old, which is crazy to think about. Mm-hmm. But anyway, from the time I was pre-memory, right? Like I, was believed and was told very clearly, like, your body's not okay. You need to try to become thinner. And the way to do that is to control what you eat, right? And so that messaging was just sort of like the background of my entire life from a very young age. I sometimes think about my relationship with food, like diet, how am I going to lose weight? What to eat, what not to eat? Oh my gosh, I ate too much, right? All of that sort of like noise around food, all of that stuff, like that constant like thought chatter in my brain around food. I think of it as like kind of like the ticker tape behind of my life. Like it was the ticker tape like going on behind whatever was like at the forefront of my brain. So it was like I'd be like going to school or hanging out with friends or doing family stuff, but like in the background at all times was this: don't eat that, do eat this. What's the next way you're going to lose 5 pounds? What's the next way you're going to lose 30 pounds? Like it was just like constantly, good food, bad food, like trying to resist food, became like a big part of it. Like sitting on my hands, trying not to eat the cheese plate at, the dinner party or whatever. Right. And so it was just that constant background noise of just dieting. And then obviously, also failing at dieting. So I was never very good at dieting. I now realize that most people are not very good at dieting, right? Like I would, stick to my thing for, however long it was, days, weeks, whatever. And then I would, like just sort of dramatically fall off the wagon. And when I would fall off the wagon, it would be like rummaging through the cabinets, like sticking my finger into like strawberry jam jars and like eating an entire jar, of strawberry jam with my finger, like in the front of the refrigerator, like those kinds of things, And so this was my life for a really, really long time. I ended up at some point in treatment for binge eating disorder. And even after going into treatment, I struggled for many, many years, largely because this problem is so misunderstood by our culture. There's a lot of social and political reasons why it's very hard to come by reasonable treatment for this kind of issue. And so, yeah, like for many years, I was like, there's something not okay with my, there's something's not working here in my relationship with food, right? I sort of began to identify as a person who had some sort of like, kind of disordered relationship with food. And I was looking for help and I couldn't find it anywhere. And, again, I tried a million things. I think my parents spent, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on treatment for me. It really wasn't until, I learned some things that are now becoming more commonplace, sort of the non-diet approach, understanding that binges are caused by dieting. The answer to binges is not trying to buckle down and control even harder, those kinds of things, which I'm sure we'll get into in this conversation, that I, kind of finally was able to really kind of break free, in quotes, from this issue. And it obviously ended up looking entirely different. What freedom looks like today looks entirely different than what I ever thought it would look like, because I grew up thinking that freedom looked like controlling your food to a T and being able to have perfect willpower and like have the perfect body. And now it's like, oh, I realized that like the constant pursuit of those things was where all of my trouble began. And, my sanity really rests in things like accepting my body for what it is today and loving myself unconditionally for who I am today, and all of these things that I think we're going to talk about later in this conversation. So yeah, that's why I do what I do.
Well, and one of the reasons that you're one of my favorite bloggers is because you just keep it real. So like all my clients, they probably had so many quotes that I pulled from your blog. And I remember one of my favorites is, and I use this a lot with my athletes, and I hope I do it justice, is to say that food should just be fuel, is to say that sex should only be for the purpose of reproduction.
Yeah. I love that one.
Yeah, where they're like, oh, I have to eat this because, I'm a runner and I've got, well, no, you can enjoy your food and have that balance too. But that brings me to one of my questions is these lines have gotten blurred between treating and fueling ourselves, but then also having to fit the societal idea of, like you said, that pursuit of having to diet and look a certain way. Where can we kind of get back on track?
Well, for starters, on a very basic level, we really need to start separating health, right? So meaning like generally like caring for our bodies and taking care, physically taking care of the bodies we have. We need to start separating those things from weight, right? So fat, especially in the past, let's call it 20 years, maybe a little longer, like really starting in the early 90s, maybe a tiny bit before that. But in the early 90s, when we really, really, really see this uptick of, the marketing of weight loss products and the marketing of diet products being more geared towards health, right? Like we want to make you healthy versus, what it was for a really long time, which was just vanity, like look good, look good, look good. Right. And I think at some point it has increasingly become this way, but it's sort of kind of become out of vogue to sell weight loss exclusively for vanity, right? Like now we need to have like a moralistic reason to give people to try to diet and control their size. And the reason that, our culture has really like clung to, right, is this concept of health, right? This, just to be clear, it comes from the fact that there is a correlation between higher weights and certain chronic illnesses. We actually don't have any really strong evidence that chronic illnesses are, necessarily caused by fat on the body, right? We just have this correlation, right? So if you're a larger bodied person, the probability that you're dealing with a specific kind of chronic illness goes up. But again, there are lots of people at all different sizes who are super duper healthy, and lots of people at thinner sizes who have, quote unquote, weight related chronic illnesses. And so it really begs the question, if anyone's taken any kind of like intro to statistics class, does correlation mean causation, right? And so, the more you look into this question, the more you start to kind of call out the bullshit when people, kind of just blindly assume that like you can dictate a person's health by the size of their body, right? And this sort of, this sort of correlation has sort of become, society has sort of decided, right, oh, we're not going to consider the fact that correlation doesn't equal causation. And maybe, it's not that fat causes diabetes. Maybe, there's something else that causes diabetes that also just happens to correlate with weight. So for instance, like I have, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Linda Bacon, but she's the author of Health at Every Size. She has this really, really great parallel that she draws when talking about this correlation versus causation issue. She says, blaming poor health on fatness is kind of like blaming lung cancer on having yellow teeth, right? Like if you have yellow teeth, you're more likely to have lung cancer. But does that mean that having yellow teeth actually causes lung cancer? Right. No. Probably there's like a third party factor going on called smoking that's contributing to both of these things. And in the case of weight and health, you kind of have a similar thing. Like there are a lot of things that may contribute to weight gain over time that also contribute to chronic health issues, potentially. And some of those things, I mean, it could be, there's again, a variety of things. It's not just food, it's stress, it's stigma. I mean, it's all sorts of things that could fall into that sort of like third party category, like the smoking category, or the thing that might be causing both. But, again, the factor we don't look at that science in our culture, right? Like in our culture, we've skipped that whole step and just decided, well, if you just make people thinner by any means necessary, they'll be healthier, right? And we've really stepped into this like attitude that health and weight are the same thing, that you can look at a person and by just taking a look at their size, you can know whether or not they're healthy without knowing anything about their actual health behaviors or about their actual health vitals, without knowing their blood pressure, without knowing their, blood sugar measurement, any of that. You can just decide, oh, that person's unhealthy because they're fat. And that is super, super problematic, because basically what's happened is culturally, we've given people the ability to turn what used to be vanity, the aggressive pursuit of weight loss. And by the way, it wasn't really just vanity. I mean, that's a kind of an unfair assumption to even make that, because truly, like, if you're like specifically, I'll speak for women, but I think this is increasingly, the case for men as well, and people of all genders, right? Like in the 80s, right? Like, or, for now several decades, you're 100% being judged by your size all the time in our culture. And so, vanity is a really hard word. It's not really the correct word for this, because that sort of puts the onus on the individual as being the problem, when really, a society which is constantly oppressing and creating prejudice and creating opportunities and disadvantages for people on the basis of size is really the issue. But I'm kind of digressing. The point is, this used to be.
Going.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're on a roll.
You do your thing.
I am. You caught me. This is a big topic. I could go a million different ways with it, but the idea, what used to be vanity has now become this health imperative. And I think that that's really helped. That's changed the dialogue around this. And it's made it such that, it's like super fashionable to be like a crazy dieter.
Right.
In a way where in the past, people may have just been considered more of a vanity issue. Although again, it wasn't really a vanity issue. It was a prejudice issue all along. But this is how the narrative has changed over time. So right now we have a situation in which, dieting, which used to just be like, oh, that chick's just trying to look good, has become this like moralistic health imperative. And that's really, 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 really damaged people. It's not evidence-based. We have a situation where people are getting shitty treatment when they go to the doctors because they're being told to lose weight to manage these chronic health conditions, when in reality, in a lot of instances, even if you were able to lose a bunch of weight, like, are you doing that healthfully? Probably not. Like in most cases, not. And the reason I know that is because most people aren't even able to do it, right? Like 95% of people who try to lose weight are going to gain the weight back plus some, right? Well, they're going to gain the weight back for sure. And then maybe about a third of the people who try will even gain back more, right? So it's like, this is not evidence-based medicine. Like, now I'm fully on my rant, but like prescribing dieting as a health measure, like, is not evidence-based care. It's not based in any kind of science. It's based on this like assumption delusion that like you should be able to control your weight, and that weight is, you know, an accurate measurement and predictor of health, which it is also not. So it's like we have like our entire medical system, our entire like, you know, way that we culturally think about health based on two just bold-faced just assumptions, right, that are not based in fact or science at all, which is one, you know, if you lose a bunch of weight, you'll be healthier. Not necessarily true, far from it. And number two, that you can and should be able to lose weight. And if you're not able to permanently keep weight off, there's something wrong with you, rather than like looking at the science and like, okay, well, 95% of the population can't permanently lose quote unquote significant amounts of weight. So does that really mean that 95% of our population is just like lazy and like, you know, has food problems? And, you know, and the narrative also around why people can't keep weight off is constantly changing as well, right? Like, so it used to be, and it still is to some extent, like lazy, undisciplined, all of that, that's still around. But now there's really more nuanced, more interesting rationalizations for why diets don't work that always put the onus on the individual. Things like even the emotional eating narrative, right? Like this food for fuel narrative, right? This idea that like, oh, you know, I can't lose weight because I eat my feelings, right? Or because, that's the reason I can't stick to my diet is because I'm an emotional eater. That narrative can be used for a lot of harm as well, right? Like, I'm sorry, but like emotional eating is not the reason you can't stick to, you know, an 1,800 calorie a day diet or whatever, you know? So anyway, that is, there's a lot going on in that question, but, you know, to I think get to the heart of it, you know, we really need to be taking a hard look at where we rationalize what is effectively for many people disordered eating behaviors for the sake of, and call it health. I would also go so far to say is that there's a lot of people out there, and I was one of them. So maybe I'll just speak for myself. When I was really struggling, I would call it health when I actually knew damn well that I just wanted to look thin. But in public, I would call it health, right? Like in public, I would be like, you know, oh yeah, no, I'm a vegan this week, or I'm this week, or I'm that this week. And oh, it's for ethical reasons. And in fact, I knew damn well it wasn't actually in my case, right? And of course there are, you know, very legitimate, real ethical vegans out there. So I'm certainly not making any kind of point about that. But in my case, as a disordered eater who was just trying to rationalize restriction in public, I often would use the health card as a way to rationalize doing what was actually something very, both mentally and physically unhealthy for me. And I think we see that a lot too. A lot of people, you know, I remember I wrote a blog post, this was years ago. I wrote a blog post called "Stop Saying Healthy When You Mean Skinny." You know, and because it's, you know, people use that language all the time to rationalize dieting. Like if people actually had to say what they really mean, and I force my clients to do this, like if they start using like vague bullshit language like that, I'll be like, no, say what you mean, because we can't do this work unless you're 100% honest with me and yourself. So don't, you know, if you mean thin when you say healthy, just say thin, just say it. Right. Because then we can have an honest conversation about what's really happening in your brain.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that, you know, that makes so much sense, especially when they go into a typical medical model and maybe they truly are struggling with something health. And then even the physician turns it right back to their weight. And then that gets overlooked. You know, maybe their blood pressure is elevated because they're chronically stressed and pulling their hair out and need to be able to learn how to juggle 5 kids and a job. And so then, of course, let's just, well, if I lose weight, then I'll be able to do all that better, too. Oh, gosh.
And again, I mean, I always come back to whenever I'm like getting, you know, hot and bothered about this, I always come back to, I'm like, well, you know what? Like, even if your health did wildly improve if you lost 50 pounds, again, like, do you have an evidence-based, safe, like proven safe way of getting there? And the answer is no. No, like anytime you go on a diet, you're taking a huge gamble. It's a huge gamble. It's like sometimes I correlate or I parallel it to like playing the lottery, right? Again, like 95% chance of loss, 5% chance that you'll be able to keep weight off just for like 3 years. Like every year you keep it off, the numbers go, it's like ducks falling. It's like every, you know, if it's like how many people are able to sustain a 5-year period of significant weight loss or 10 year, that 5% literally dwindles. It literally goes down over time. But I'm like, you know, and dieting has serious side effects. Like, would you take a medication that had a 95%, failure rate. 95% chance it's just not going to work at all. 3%, 30% chance that you're going to actually gain more weight. So the problem in quotes that you're trying to fix is actually going to get worse. Mm-hmm. And, a long list of side effects, right? Like horrible prognosis and long list of side effects. Would you take that medicine? I highly doubt it. And as a doctor, would you prescribe that medicine? I highly doubt it. But with weight, it's like we just turn a blind eye because culturally we just have all these assumptions about weight. We are committed to the idea that our weight is in our exclusive control of willpower. We're committed to the idea that we're robots, not animals, and that we should be able to control basic biological instincts like eating.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Yeah.
You do such a great job of really challenging one to put any judgment on our bodies, with whether that negative or positive. Why do you think this is so important?
I mean, again, I just think that the majority of disordered eating, of course it can be triggered by like bad doctors telling you to go on diets to save your life. For sure that happens. But I think by and large in our culture, the vast majority of sort of disordered eating that we see, and diet binge cycling and the feeling crazy around food and all the shit that most people and definitely most women are dealing with on some sort of spectrum basis, is due to, just bias and prejudice around weight, right? And status seeking, or, wanting to avoid negative prejudice and bias, or wanting to acquire positive status, right? Mm-hmm. Depending on the situation, right? But in either situation, it's a status issue, right? Like, I don't want to be lesser status by gaining weight or being larger. I want to be have higher status by being as thin as possible and being as close to the beauty ideal, the current beauty ideal, as possible. And so, I don't even necessarily think it's about how we judge ourselves. I think it's just like this problem of prejudice, of weight-based prejudice, whether it be towards ourselves or towards other people, is driving this issue by and large, right? For the vast majority of people. Now, not all people. I think that there are absolutely situations in which disordered eating can come about for, reasons that have nothing to do with prejudice necessarily. But the vast majority of disordered eating in our culture is triggered by some sort of event where somebody had the thought, people would like me more if I lost weight. Mm-hmm. I'd be more beautiful if I lost weight. People don't like me because I'm fat, so I must try to lose weight, right? And therefore must try to restrict my food and control my basic biological instincts of eating. And once you get into that rabbit hole, it's really hard to get yourself out of, right? I mean, it's a cycle, right? Diet binge cycle. For most people, the cycle is try to lose weight, fail miserably, and have like a binge eating episode potentially, or even just like a rebound where you feel like shit about yourself on the way back up. It's like you were feeling so good, you were getting so high on the way back down, thinking, oh yeah, man, I look so good. Like, I'm so hot, everyone's going to love me. And then bam, right? You lose it, you rebound, you gain the weight back, and you feel awful about yourself, right? Yeah. And so, this is of course, when we feel awful about ourselves, we just want the high of feeling good again. So we try to diet again. Mm-hmm. And then, this is how the cycle continues. But you can see how this cycle, this diet binge cycle, or this even just weight cycling, right? Like, not everyone identifies as a binge eater necessarily, but most people who have lost weight on a diet have also had the experience of rebounding in some way, shape, or form, even if it was just like, ugh, I'm over it, I'm giving up, and then I just, slowly gain the weight back, right? Most people have this experience of cycling, and they don't know how to get out, because when you get up, when you're rebounding, you feel like shit about yourself, you think the answer is to go back to the high of trying to lose it. But you can see, getting back to my original point, you can see how this is all fueled by prejudice, right? You can see how this is all fueled by the high that comes from weight loss, by and large, is the high of status seeking. Mm-hmm. By and large is the high of everyone's going to love me, unicorns and rainbows are going to pop out of the sky because I'm going to have a perfect body, I'm going to have all the thin privilege is the term that gets thrown, that gets used the most in my arena. Right. All that beauty privilege, all that, like, I'm going to get all the cookies, metaphorically, right? You're not going to get any cookies non-metaphorically, right? No cookies in real life, just metaphoric cookies, right? I'm going to get all the bennies, all the benefits of being as close to the beauty ideal as I possibly can. And that is all based on status and prejudice and judgment, right? And then, obviously feel like shit about myself when I'm on the way up. I think what's interesting is that, I think a lot of people, when they're doing this work, and when I talk about non-judgment and talk about letting go of prejudice, right, of weight-based prejudice, a lot of them, they just want to feel good. They want to not feel like shit about themselves when they're on the way up, but they want to keep pursuing the positive status when they're on the way down, meaning they want to like pat themselves on the back when they're losing weight, and they get all happy when they're losing weight. Everyone's going to love me. Unicorns and rainbows going to pop out of the sky. Right. And then, but then they feel like shit. And oftentimes people come and read my work when they feel like shit. Right. And when they're feeling badly about themselves because they're on the rebound, they're binging, they're coming back up on the weight scale, whatever it is, they feel badly. And that's when it's like, oh yeah, your message resonates so much. I don't want to hate myself anymore. But then if they get back on that diet train, or if something happens where they perceive themselves to be losing weight, they're really attached to that positive judgment of like, oh my God, yeah, I look so hot, not realizing that like they kind of like one is the flip side of the other, right? So it's like thin privilege and negative weight bias, or like, positive weight bias and negative weight bias kind of are two sides of the same coin. And so, I think culturally, this is just a serious issue. Mm-hmm. It's not just about how I judge myself. It's about how I judge the world. Like, am I participating in, do I have weight bias, period? Not only towards myself, but towards other people. And again, I'll just say, I think that this is really important. A lot of people think they only have weight bias towards themselves. And they like to pretend like, oh, she looks beautiful the way she is. I don't judge other people for their weight. That's bullshit, right? Like, prejudice is prejudice, whether you're directing it towards yourself or you're directing it towards other people. Like, for the most part, right? Like, if you're having bias towards yourself, that means I can guarantee you that if you looked at two pictures of people and one was thinner and one was fatter, you're going to have a positive judgment towards the thinner person versus the fatter person, right? Like, there's no way in hell that's, that you can hate yourself for being larger, but not also have that experience, right? Yeah. It kind of goes both ways. So for me, like, this is weight bias, fat prejudice, and size-based prejudice is the fuel that really runs this whole diet binge cycling. And I would make the argument, even in the case of like restrictive eating disorders, a lot of times, this weight bias really heavily fuels this problem called, disordered dysfunctional eating, diet binge cycling, whatever you want to call it. Again, it's a spectrum. It can look a lot of different ways for different people. But, and that, this fuel is not just an individual problem of, oh, let me not hate myself. It's a greater social problem of like weight bias in general in our culture, and just like rampant prejudice in our culture. You have little girls who are 3 and 4 years old knowing that fat is bad and thin is good, right? And fearing to gain weight, like in some instances, more than they fear losing a parent or getting hit by a car. Right. I mean, like, that's like a real statistic. And so, yeah, like, for me, it's very clear. It became one of the things that became very clear to me when I really got into recovery and really started to understand, what no one had told me when I was in treatment, when I was getting all that shitty treatment that didn't work. It was largely because no one was having honest, real conversations about the very serious social problem and institutional problem in the US and around the world of weight discrimination, right? And the fact that it's not just in my head that I'm scared to lose weight. That's not just like me being like a pathological eating disordered person. I was taught to fear weight gain. And I was taught through watching fat people be, prejudiced against, right? And discriminated against. And thin people getting rewarded, especially thin women, but thin people. I mean, it really is. This is at this point a super all gendered thing. Although I do think that it's, a highly sort of intersectional issue that affects women in a slightly different way than it affects men, by virtue of the fact that women's, entire value in a lot of instances is wrapped up in this beauty ideal, right? So, yeah, we need to be, having really serious conversations about how we judge people, not just ourselves, but all people on the basis of size, and how our culture and even larger, like political and government institutions and things like that, like for instance, our medical field, healthcare, right, the war on obesity, dear God, right? We need to really think about how we, in like the really large scheme of things, perpetuate weight bias, right? And how that affects and is increasingly affecting people's relationships with food and their overall mental and physical well-being as a result.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're seeing that now in the schools where this war on obesity. So then they're addressing their weight and then tying the health outcome to it. Like this generation's, not going to outlive their parents, and starting that fear. You'll hear kids talk about like, well, I got to lose weight because I don't want to have heart disease like dad or grandpa did and, pass away early. So already at 7, they're worried that their weight's going to cause them to die early, which is not a fair thing for a child to put together. But that's what our society's done.
Oh, 100%. The amount of fear and neurosis around food in children has increased quite a bit. Right. They've not actually gotten thinner. Like the war on obesity was a massive, and is currently a massive failure in the government's attempt to just eradicate fat people, basically. But fundamentally what it did do, again, talking about, this drug that has a 95% failure rate, but a long list of side effects, what the war on obesity has made children very, afraid of food and highly disordered in their thinking about food. Weight-based bullying has been seriously on the rise. Now, weight-based bullying has been around for a while, right? Like as long as there's been weight prejudice, there's been weight-based bullying. But in schools, this has now become like a much, 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 much bigger problem because to a certain extent, it is sanctioned by the schools, right? I mean, you hear these stories of kids being publicly weighed in gym class and their weights being called out. You hear all of these things and people basically getting weight-based grades in school. That's something, parent, you could go home with a pink slip. If you're the wrong size, you could go home with a pink slip to your parent saying, I failed, thinness. I failed thinness, basically.
Ridiculous.
And so this is really, this is a huge problem. I mean, the war on obesity has largely been a disaster. So many casualties with like no improved health outcomes whatsoever. Because, they were focusing on the wrong thing, we can talk about health, we can talk about managing chronic illnesses, but why don't we actually talk about actual behaviors? Like instead of talking about yellow teeth, so instead of talking about yellow teeth, let's talk about smoking. Like instead of talking about weight, instead of talking about fat cells on the body, right? Let's talk about, getting pleasurable movement and, eating vegetables and getting people out of, in a lot of instances, the real issue is that people don't have access to health, right? People don't have, this is a highly socioeconomically skewed situation, right? Like issue, in many instances, people are in, positions where, they're working 3 jobs, raising families, and are 50 miles away from the nearest grocery store that sells a vegetable, and so let's talk about these issues. Let's talk about, the actual like institutional and social realities, certainly in the United States, that are keeping people from being able to live well, right? And feel good in their bodies, rather than being like, oh, your back hurts, your knee hurts, you have a bloody nose, you're too fat. Instead of, having hard and fast rules around what I should and shouldn't eat, just kind of listening to my body, getting in touch with, practicing mindfulness about what feels good to me, that work really can only be effectively done in tandem with body image work, where if what feels good to you is to have like a, super big high calorie meal, right? Like that's okay. Because in a lot of instances that will be the case. I mean, the other thing that I think is really hard with intuitive eating is that people are like, oh, when I listen to my body, I'm going to eat, it's going to look really clean and it's going to look really, I don't know, diety effectively.
Right.
And the truth of the matter is like, we need a lot more calories. We need a lot more food. We need fat, carbs, protein. We need all the things. We need a lot of food, most of us, much more than diet culture tells us to eat. And if we, in some instances, we're going to need like bigger amounts of food, larger amounts of food, like it's really going to go up and down. And so I think making peace with the fact that when you are really listening to your body in a weight neutral way and really being honest, it might look different than you think. Yeah. So exactly. I would say, like number one, so that's kind of a combination. It's like kind of listening to your body and like deciding what feels good for you personally. But that work can only be effectively done in a weight neutral context, because if it's not done in a weight neutral context, you're going to constantly be like second guessing and judging and feeling like you're doing something wrong, when in fact you might be doing something very, very right. I mean, there are, eating disorder people out there, eating disorder therapists out there who are like, in some instances, if you have a starving person on your hands, like, they need to eat like refined carbs and refined sugar and all these things that get totally villainized, because they just desperately need calories. And that is the health. That is the best thing that they can do for their health, is get the fastest calories possible. And so, we need to just let go of this like very rigid idea of health and just start, thinking about like, okay, what would feel good to me right now? Also, starting to prioritize health, mental health as part of the health equation is super important, right? Like, I'm sure, I have days when I do things that don't make me feel as great, right? I have days when I eat stuff that doesn't make me feel super awesome. That isn't like super, like food is just fuel, right? It's just, either pleasure, which is awesome. I mean, I think pleasure in and of itself, I think like, eating something just for pleasure is totally like a physically healing thing, because it's like stress relieving and wonderful, and like makes me connected to the simple pleasures of life. But even sometimes when I'm just like running around and just like not eating super well because I'm busy at work or whatever, like that's going to happen. And that's, I have to be able to give myself breaks on things like that, right? Like I have to be, my mental health is really founded on non-judgment of my food and body, right? Like constantly beating myself up for what I eat or what I look like drove me full on crazy, right? Like it really drove me to some very dangerous places and dark places in my life. And I recognize that my mental health is founded on my ability to eat, in any way and feel emotionally okay about it, right? Like even if I eat something that doesn't make me feel awesome, like my ability to be like, oh, well, you know what? I just have a bellyache, no big deal. That's mental health, right? That is mental health, is to be able to even eat something that doesn't make you feel great. And you're like, oh, well, I can just, let that go. So yeah, like intuitive eating, got to be weight neutral, body image work, mental health. I mean, the mental health thing also really, crosses over into, it's not just weight bias in our country, although I do think that that's sort of the biggest issue is weight bias and weight prejudice. Because of the commingling of weight and health, we've also found ourselves in this situation where we really moralize health, and we really make health into this thing that like you're a bad like you're like a lazy, horrible person if you don't do health correctly. Not even necessarily weight, although obviously those things get confused all the time. But even just health itself gets really heavily moralized in our culture. And it's like, I feel like I spend a good portion of my time with clients just getting them to just chill out about sometimes doing unhealthy things.
Right.
Like, it's okay, girl. You like, ate a thing that gave you a stomach ache, like it's okay.
It'll go away.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like you've got to be able to roll with the punches, or you've got to be able to like, just, there has to be room for your humanity. And so that's, I mean, again, there's a lot of issues even in just this question. You guys are asking really great questions that I could go in a million directions with, but, right off the bat, these are some of the things that I think about, and I think about like, okay, how do I actually let go of judgment? It's things like, working on my weight discrimination, weight bias, doing things like really prioritizing my wants and needs over the culture's demands of me. It's doing things like prioritizing my mental health, practicing radical acceptance, practicing, being able to let things go. Those kinds of, these are just some of the things that, I talk about, with my clients when we're talking about like letting go of this sort of like deep shame and judgment of our food choices and of our bodies.
And that is like, gives us to our last question you've already started talking about, but how do you live out the Phit philosophy? How do you try to balance performance, health, intellect, and taking time for self when you're so busy?
It's interesting. I'm going to kind of repeat myself, but like, I really do that intuitively. So for me, balance in all areas of my life, for the most part, is an intuitive process. I have a couple little things in my life where I try to stick to some semblance of a boundary, like sleep, for instance. Like, I know if I don't get enough sleep, like I'm going to feel bad. So I'm like pretty not strict with myself, but I'm just like, I need my sleep, like, so there are certain things in life where I think like having kind of, those kinds of boundaries can be really useful for self-care. Even things like brushing my teeth and washing my face. Like, I don't intuitively brush my teeth and wash my face. I try to just do it no matter what. And sometimes I don't do it, and that's okay. But for the most part, most areas of my life, when it comes to self-care, I am very intuitive, meaning like I do what feels right and what feels good to me on a rolling basis. I don't have a lot of hard and fast rules in my life about self-care. It's mainly just like regularly practicing tuning into myself and being like, okay, girl, what do you need? Again, there are always the exceptions. Like I try to brush my teeth every night, no matter what, whether I feel like it or not. And again, sometimes I don't, and that's okay. But, like for the most part, I think, certainly when it comes to food, I would say for the most part, when it comes to exercise-ish, I'm pretty intuitive. I mean, again, sometimes you got to like book that into your schedule, but pretty intuitive. And, stress management, certainly, like for me, that is my biggest health issue right now. Like today, like I would say since I stopped dieting, my biggest health issue that I'm dealing with on a regular basis is stress management. That's the hardest one for me, is stress management. And so I recognize that that's gotta be an intuitive practice, stress management, for the most part. Although again, there are kind of like weird things that I, try to add in every day, even if I don't feel like it. Like I try to meditate every day, even if I don't feel like it. But again, I fail sometimes, and that's okay. But like in terms of stress, like, in terms of work, like I work intuitively. Like some days I can like get a lot done, and other times like I'm just beat and I just need to relax. And that might be unique to me as a person who works for themselves and by and large runs their own schedule. But yeah, like I guess my point is I really do self-care in general in an intuitive way based on like how I feel, with a few exceptions. And I'll say actually about the exceptions, because people always have questions to me about my exceptions to this intuitive living thing. The exceptions are almost always things that I want to add in rather than things that I want to take out. So, there's a difference between adding in vegetables and taking out sugar. Right? Like adding in vegetables or adding in, whatever, something that's going to help me balance my blood sugar. Or this is actually a really good example. Like I work with clients who have blood sugar issues and who have tons and tons of restriction and diet related trauma, and are just not like, it's not mentally or even possibly physically healthy for them to just eradicate sugar from their lives just because they're having blood sugar management issues because of this, for whatever reason. It's not realistic. They end up binging on the stuff because they feel so restricted, and they're dealing with all this diet related trauma and blah, blah, blah. Right. And so, a very basic thing that I would say to somebody who's struggling with blood sugar issues is like, okay, instead of focusing on taking out, every ounce of sugar, why don't you focus on adding in, protein or fat or fiber or, something that's going to help you absorb that blood sugar into your blood more slowly. Right. And so for the most part, the things where I'm like, okay, I try to brush my teeth every night. I try to meditate every day. Sometimes I don't do it, and that's okay. But with those things, the things that I kind of make exceptions to my intuitive living situation, they're almost always like things that I want to add in rather than things that I want to take out. Taking out is very hard for human beings, right? Abstinence is from what we want to do is very, very hard for animals. It's not in our nature. It's not in our like natural. It's not in our constitution to resist stuff, right? Resist stuff that we want to. But it is not always easy, not always perfect. Like I said, I don't brush my teeth every single night, no matter what. And I don't always meditate every single day, no matter what. But it's easier to add in healthy stuff than I think it is to take out unhealthy things in a lot of instances. So, again, I intuitively will like back off. Something's like, oh, I don't feel good. I don't think I should do that today. That's intuitive, right? I moderate, in quotes, through intuition. But when I have those few things where I really try to do them on a regular basis, whether I kind of quote feel like it or not, it's almost always stuff that I'm adding in rather than stuff that I'm taking out, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Definitely. Oh, Isabel, that's why I love your blog so much. I just love your wisdom and how you keep it real. And thanks for coming on today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is really fun. I liked this conversation a
Oh, me
lot.
too. All right. Well, bye, Queens. Today's episode is brought to you by yours truly. I'm excited to announce the releasing soon of my book, Finding Your Sweet Spot in Sport, Avoiding Relative Energy Deficit in Sport, also known as RED-S, by optimizing your energy balance. Be sure to follow me on social media or go to my website, www.beccamccombel.com, to find out when the release date is set and when it'll be on Amazon. Bye, Queens.
For additional information on today's topic and guests, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Fit for a Queen. And
Hashtag Fit for a Queen.
don't forget to rate us on iTunes. We can't wait for you to join us next time on Fit for a Queen.
Bye, Queens.